Chapter 34 is about circulation and how it's linked with gas exchange or respiration. As I previously said on the intro slide, transport systems are linked with gas exchange, or circulation is always linked with respiration. How does gas exchange take place? With diffusion. So diffusion, in order for diffusion to take place, there has to be a difference in concentration of the gases. So bringing oxygen in to the cell, there has to be a deficiency or a smaller concentration of oxygen within that cell in order for oxygen to come in, and vice versa. And for diffusion of gases to take place, in terms of the speed, it's only rapid across small distances. So anything that's bigger than a couple to a few millimeters is going to actually be slow. So the larger the distance, the slower it is. So only gases coming in, or just diffusion of gases, period, whether it's in or out, it's only rapid across small distances. There's three types of systems for gas exchange. Basic, with basic transport of gases, the cells are in direct contact with the actual environment. So typically this is going to be single-celled organisms, sponges, this would apply to those as well. So the gas exchange takes place right across the cell. What we saw in the last chapter, gastrovascular cavity, the gastrovascular cavity came up with digestion. So for gastrovascular cavity, digestion and a distribution of substances is going to take place in the same cavity. And flatworms are an example of that as well. The last type, which we are going to be most familiar with, is circulatory system. And this is where the fluid moves to the tissues and cells for the actual exchange. And this takes place in organisms that are typically larger than the ones that I previously mentioned. There are three components to a circulatory system. There has to be fluid, interconnecting vessels, and a pump. So the fluid being our blood, interconnecting vessels, the couple kinds of those, and the heart is our pump. Now there's two groups of circulatory systems, open versus closed. So what exactly is the difference? In an open circulatory system, the blood and the fluid bathes the organs directly or surrounds the organs directly to provide any molecules as necessary. A closed circulatory system, the blood is contained in the vessels and pumped around the body. Now, in the open circulatory system, there's something known as hemolymph. Hemolymph is the interstitial fluid which has blood in it and also lymph cells, so things like white blood cells, again, depending on what the organs need. There is a heart that pumps the hemolymph into space around the organs known as sinuses. What types of organisms have an open circulatory system? Much more basic organisms. Again, we're complex. So things that are pretty basic, arthropods and mollusks. Arthropods are things, I always try to remember them as things that crunch. They're insects. Like if you step on them, they crunch, which is kind of gross, but those are arthropods. And mollusks are things like snails and slugs. So they have that open circulatory system where the fluid, the hemolymph, surrounds the organs directly. So in a closed circulatory system, again, I kind of said this, the blood and the fluid are separate from one another, and they, again, are in vessels. Examples, annelids, cephalopods, and vertebrates or vertebrates. Annelids are earthworms. Cephalopods are organisms like octopus and squids, and vertebrates are us, anything with that spinal cord and vertebrae spine backbone. This diagram shows you the anatomy of different kinds of vessels, comparing an artery on the left to capillaries in the middle and veins on the right. So what they have in common to start, the inside of all three of these vessels have endothelium tissue. And it's a type of cell tissue that is very smooth. And it needs to be smooth because
Mom, why are you doing that?
Because hold on. It needs to be smooth. It needs to be smooth because blood needs to cruise through smoothly and not get caught, as we need blood to get through our bodies quickly. Okay, so I'm not exactly sure what I just said a moment ago. I think I was saying that the endothelium needs to be very smooth because, again, blood is traveling through it. Of all three of these vessels, the capillaries are the smallest, so the endothelium is the thinnest, and there is a second layer to the capillaries called a basal lamina, still very thin vessels. In terms of the diameter, the thickness, pretty much not much thicker or bigger than a red blood cell. So think about like a single file line of like people moving through the capillaries, like one at a time. They can't, or they shouldn't at least, clump up. So very thin vessels. Looking on the right at the veins, so we still have, going in to out, we still have the endothelium. But if you notice on the inside, what's added in is there's an extra valve, and the valve helps with moving the blood through when there's not as much pressure. So veins return blood back to the heart to then be going into the arteries and moving back through the body, okay, which I'll get more into that later. Okay, so there's an extra valve for helping with that low pressure situation that veins have. And then the next layer is smooth muscle, helping again with contracting, getting the blood to go back to where it needs to go. And then on the outside, we have connective tissue. Now, comparing the vein to the left-hand side, the arteries, which arteries move the blood away from the heart as it's being pumped, arteries are thicker. So we have a higher pressure. We need the blood to get to the rest of our body. So we need a thicker layer of smooth muscle. Even though the blood's being pumped by the heart, we need to assist it in shooting through the rest of our body. So the muscle layer is thicker, and then the connective tissue is also thicker for arteries. And it doesn't have that extra valve inside because we have a high pressure situation with the arteries. Here's a table comparing the different types of blood vessels. Arteries pump blood away from the heart. There's a lot of pressure. They have thick, strong walls, and this is where you can feel your pulse. So if you put your hand or your two fingers on the side of your neck, you can feel your pulse. It's because of the artery, the carotid artery to be specific. Next up, capillaries. They connect arteries and veins, and they have very thin walls, single cell diameter. And there's a high exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide taking place in capillaries. Veins take blood back to the heart. There's low pressure. They are thinner compared to arteries, but larger diameter compared to capillaries, certainly. Valves, the valves inside, again, I mentioned that they have a low pressure, but they also prevent backflow. We want the blood to be returning back to the heart, and there's a low pressure situation, so we don't want it coming back the other way. So the valves help that. Now, a couple other little types, I guess, of blood vessels, you might see mention arterioles And arterioles are a branch of arteries that connect to the capillaries. And then another term you could see are venules, and venules are what connects the capillaries to the veins to then return back to the heart. Some terminology that you need to remember when we're talking about the circulatory system and specifically the heart, the difference between an atrium versus a ventricle in the heart. So the way that I would remember it, blood arrives through an atrium. So arrives at the atrium and it vacates through a ventricle. So I try to put the letters together in a sentence so it would help me remember. So again, blood arrives through the atrium and vacates through a ventricle. So when we're looking at different organisms and their circulatory system, there's single versus a double. Fish are an example of a single circulation pathway. The heart of a fish has only 2 chambers, which will be different for us. If you look at the diagram, you can see there's a heart and the different colors to kind of explain. Red blood indicates blood that is high in oxygen, and then blue would be depleted or oxygen poor. So looking at the heart receives through its atrium oxygen poor blood. And once it arrives, it needs to go to the gills. That's where there's going to be a gas exchange. So the blood is going to vacate through the ventricle part of the heart and then go across the gills to become more oxygen rich and then move through the body. And then as it goes through via diffusion, it's going to lose oxygen, and then it makes its way again back to the heart. Okay, now the part that gets a little bit confusing with the letters, the A and the V, please remember to build on this, which is totally the opposite. Arteries those are the vessels that take blood away, okay, which is a tad conflicting with the whole A business. So comparing now, hopefully I didn't confuse you any, comparing now double circulation. Double circulation, we are an example of that. So looking at the picture, we have 4 chambers to our heart. So we have a left and right ventricle and a left and right atrium or atria. So looking at the picture, like kind of following, I guess, the oxygen poor blood. So the oxygen poor blood is going to be pumped and vacating the ventricle on the right, and it moves across the pulmonary circuit, where there's lung capillaries, so diffusion of oxygen can take place, making the blood rich in oxygen. The blood then cruises back into the heart and arrives through the left atrium, and now it's good to go through the rest of the body. It's pumped full of blood, and it's going to leave and vacate through the left ventricle and then make its way through our body. And then, now we need more oxygen, so it comes back into the heart at the right atrium. So hopefully that made sense. Spend a little time following the pathway, and again, hopefully it helps you in terms of the chambers of the heart. Again, blood arrives at an atrium and vacates through a ventricle.